So today I'll talk about 3 projects I've worked on during my career. And those projects also happen to be my journey as a designer from mouse to keyboard to AI. And it all started with the mouse. So in 2007, 13 years ago, I was obsessed with a simple idea. What if you could directly edit your website with the context menu of your mouse? That you could basically just click on anything and edit it right away. Because if you think about it, the context menu at the time, or still in the browser, is not that powerful, right? Copy and paste are probably the most useful features. But what if it was radically more powerful? And so that gave birth to this idea. When you look back at the time, it wasn't really a fun time to be around when it comes to content editing, right? And so I wanted to really find a way to make it more meaningful. And so as you can see, this is exactly the same website as before. And the question really became, what if the UI of the content management system was part of the website itself? And so in this case, you can scroll down, and then if you hover over something and you click on it, it instantly turns this thing that is just a layer of text into a text area. So it's technically still just a text area because content editable didn't exist yet at the time. But it gave you the impression that you're manipulating the actual website. And I felt that was quite powerful. The other thing that was powerful was that the entire promise of the system was based on the context menu. And so what was interesting about that is that it forced me to make every single design decision within this project contextually. So even as you had a lot of things in the system, it would never feel complicated because it would always ever show the things that are actually relevant in that given context. And to this day, that actually heavily influenced the way I design experiences. So when you added, like, let's say you right-clicked on this text and you say, I want to add a list. It created this small instance of like a text editor that was really just like a series of text areas that looked like a text editor. And I soon became very obsessed with this part of the experience, with text editors, really. So now, a word of caution here. Text editors are a world of pain. So whatever you do, don't create an editor. Just don't. Now, in my case, I was a lost soul, still am. And to this day, I think about how can you make note-taking simpler? Because what's the problem of note-taking, really? To me, I love taking notes, but then I always forget to look at my notes again. And so the problem really is that the only notes you remember are the ones you see. And that gave rise to a question. I asked myself, what if your notes were where you already are? And so I spent an awful lot of time in the browser, and I realized that I think a large part of people actually spend probably too much time in a browser. And so the question really became, what if your notes were in every new tab, so that through repetitive exposure, you don't just become more conscious, but also more mindful about the things that are going on your mind? And that really was how Mindful was born. And Mindful is a side project of mine, and it's also really an exercise in reduction. How much can you remove before something is no longer that thing? In the case of a text editor, how much can you remove before a text editor is no longer a text editor? Well, it turns out you can remove everything except one thing, and that's the cursor. Because the moment you remove the cursor, it's no longer a text editor. And so what happens when you do that? Well, I think it's quite interesting, and I'd like to show it to you. The first thing is, so this is how Mindful looks like when you start on a clean slate. And the first thing is that there's no files and folders. And that was probably the best decision I've made in my life. Because what is so nice about it is that when you want to create a note, you don't want to start your thought process by thinking about, should I create a new note? Should I add it to an old note? Should I search my note? And by the way, maybe I get distracted along the way, and then I forgot what I wanted to write down in the first place. So there's something beautiful about the simplicity of one sheet. The other advantage that came as part of that limitation, and it's also a little bit of luck, I have to say. The other thing that came was that because it is only one sheet, just like an A4 paper, you are limited in how much stuff you can write down. So it really forces you to prioritize what is actually important in my life, because the things that are not important will automatically get pushed down the more you add. So there's a beauty to it, because you cannot hide away from your own complexity, from your own mess. And so the other thing is, I was super excited about, like that stuff got pretty intense because I started to observe really how do people actually interact with text editors. And there's one thing that no one does. No one ever starts a new line with space. And that's a shame because the space is a beautiful key. It's one of the largest keys on the keyboard, and it's fun to type. So what happens? So you're in a new line, and then you could basically create content on the fly. And what's beautiful about it, because the whole thing is keyboard navigatable, it allows you to create content very, very quickly. But perhaps more importantly, this project really taught me the fundamentals of paying attention to details. Because when you look at this very situation here, what should happen when a user hits backspace? It's one of those things, one of those everyday use cases that we do all the time, and we take it for granted, but someone had to think about it. And that's what it is. That's what it means to me to design, because for us it's obvious that it should be, that it should merge with this list. But it's really not that obvious on A, how to do it, and then how it will actually translate to that. And so how would this work on a mobile device? Now, we talked about the mouse before. And with the mouse, it's pretty obvious that the mouse is context. You right-click on something, we understand what you clicked on. So what is the context here? I'd like you to pay attention to this part here. And so if we change where the text cursor is, it automatically changes the context of the keyboard. Why is that important? It is important because when you're in a list, you don't want to fiddle around and find that secret menu somewhere hidden in the keyboard on how you can indent things or move things up and down. So this simple insight really changed, this simple insight of always asking yourself, what context do you have, changed how I approach this problem. So the takeaway here for me really is, what context do you have? What is the state that your app or UI is currently in? What information do you have that can potentially anticipate or make the next step easier for the user? And so I'm happy that, like, I made a video for Mindful, and it was featured on Product Hunt. And so I'm excited that Mindful found an audience. But more importantly, this project doesn't have the scale of the work that I do at Google. But it taught me the fundamentals of what it means to design. So takeaway number one for me is really design the invisible. In an age of Instagram, Dribble, and Behance, it can be hard to work on things that you cannot record and that it will look amazing. But that's what it means to design. Because ultimately the problem here is you will never get invited to a conference, for instance, because you made sure that the text cursor sits at the right position. That's what the AI part is for. And to me, it's really, when users don't notice a detail, sometimes that's okay, because the boring interface is sometimes the exact interface that's needed. Or in Batman's terms, it's not the interface we deserve, but the one we need right now. So AI is on a lot of people's minds. And I started to get into the AI space 3 years ago when I started to turn my website into a chatbot. And it was just a fun experiment that was quite popular, and it eventually led to me working at Google in Zurich with the Assistant team. And that kicked off an important shift for me as a designer, where I no longer saw the computer as a tool, but more as an agent, as a sidekick, as a technology that could be genuinely helpful and personal. And I also got more interested in how do people and technology coexist? We have more screens and more devices than ever before in tech history. And I feel like with the rise of AI, we're facing similar challenges that Engelberg did when he worked on the first mouse. It just happens that those challenges are different. Because what does AI look like? So I really started wondering, what does AI actually look like? And I started to try to find inspiration in the real world by some really talented artists. And I also was inspired by Gleb Kuznetsov and started to visualize some of these things myself, really trying to understand how are these objects constructed and what happens to them. I also started to, I also started to get into macro photography. And so when you capture this phenomenon here for the first time and it happens right in front of you, it totally blows your mind. You can barely believe this is not CGI. And I also started to get into ink stuff, where I started to record ink fluidly, and there's something really beautiful and organic about it. And then more specifically in the context of the phone, what does an AI that is deeply integrated into your phone look like? And then also I finished some studies, some of those motion studies with sand, when I turned some of my painting work into sand. And yeah, so this is some pretty trippy stuff. To be honest, it didn't necessarily help me to figure out what does AI look like, but it helped me to derive a couple of principles on how AI should feel like. And so what does AI feel like? Well, AI should be personal. If AI is not personal, then there's really no point in calling it AI. The other thing is that AI is familiar. AI should be non-threatening. AI should be in motion. And what I mean with that is that things that are intelligent are things that we attribute liveliness to. And the things that are alive are usually things that move. So motion will become super important as we venture into the age of AI. AI is friendly, and most importantly, AI is unobtrusive. You should never use AI for the sake of AI, and even though it's obvious, sometimes I feel like it's not. And so let's see how I applied some of those principles in an actual product, in this case, Google Lens. Now, with Google Lens, you can search what you see. It's super exciting technology. And the idea here is really, if you see a chair in front of you and you want to describe how that chair looks like, good luck. It's pretty difficult. And with this technology, basically, the idea is you can point at it and you can directly do it. And so, and it started with a breakthrough in machine learning where the photos team was able to make your photos searchable. And that seems like a pretty small thing, but it's actually a big deal because all of a sudden you don't have to scroll forever anymore when you want to find that photo that you were looking for. And so the question we asked ourselves then is, what if we gave eyes to the assistant? What if there was a way that you could share what you see with an AI and then you would get help based on your surroundings? And so we were all excited about the potential of this technology, and I started to visualize a prototype early on. So in this case, you're at the library, and that was the assistant interface looked at the time. With the assistant logo here, and then you have like these tiny little buttons here. And so when you tap on that camera button, you would see that book. You tap it. The assistant would then extract all the things that are relevant within that context. And from that moment on, you can now have a conversation, like an ongoing conversation about that entity. And obviously, this whole thing was fake, but it still helped to basically get the project off the ground and find alignment on how are we going to do this, what are we actually trying to accomplish. And from that moment, it really became an exercise on how can we get this core experience right. So we worked around the clock to get the core experience in. And the first version was honestly very crude. It was basically literally the assistant UI living on top of your camera. And when we announced it, that's where it felt like the real work actually began. Because when I started to think about this product more, I realized that the assistant metaphor might not be the right metaphor for this category of product. Because if with voice you can say anything you want, right? Like you can literally talk about everything you want. With the camera, you can point at anything you want. And if you add these two technologies on top of one another, that creates a recipe for a lot of complexity. So I went back to the drawing board, and we thought about what is the best of search and assistant. And because search has really mastered the idea of relevance, right? It doesn't just show you one result, it shows you 10 results. It's a way more forgiving interface. And so the question became, how can we leverage Gestural UI and bring the stuff that is super relevant right into like above the fold, but then related content or other potential matches are below the fold. And that idea turned out to be quite effective. And it then became like an exercise on how can we create reusable components so that we can stack and create like these rich result experiences. But on a high level, the core challenge of this project was really, what is a visual language for seeing? How can you convey to a user that the machine is trying to make sense about the world around them? And one of the earlier explorations we did in collaboration with Creative Labs looked like this, if this clicker works. And it had triangles, and it was pretty fancy looking, but at the same time, I kept wondering, is it too fancy? Because there's something interesting going on. When you search for AI on Google Search, all you will see is polygons. I don't know why, but there's something going on with polygons. And so we didn't want to lean into that language of polygons. So we wanted to simplify it further. And one of the earlier stuff that I worked on had some of that thinking already in it. So that notion of what if we basically take the idea of dots that are already a familiar element within the language of Google, and then we bring it into the scene so that when you stop moving your camera, you can see how these dots start accumulating about the object of interest. And when you don't move the camera, we see that as an understanding, like as a, hey, you're probably interested in this object. And there was something there. And it then became an exercise in making this work for still images, but also for moving images. And what I did as a next step was really, how can you bring that into the real world? So I started to go to coffee shops, pointing my camera awkwardly at people around me. And then it became like, as you can see, there's these dots basically feel almost, they have liveliness to it. A couple of dots pop up, and they try to make sense what is there. And then some of them disappear, but some of them turn into something. And those dots that turn into something are the entities that we recognize. And as a next step, it was really the question about, can we bring content directly into the real world? And so imagine your same coffee shop, and you start panning the camera, and then we automatically display a result or something like that. And that was an interesting day. I remember when I visualized this, because it kind of made me smile, because it almost felt like I was building a right-click, like a context menu for the real world, because essentially that's what you're doing, right? You're pointing the camera at something, and you're getting the context about that object. And so we closely worked together with the Maps team, and they also started to work on more AR-based experiences where you bring restaurants directly into the scene. Or instead of always following your blue dot where you easily get lost, what if there was a fox or something that you could follow, and so you don't get lost in the city? And so, but if this project taught me anything, it's that the future is not necessarily futuristic. And what I mean with that is that it's so easy to get tangled up in those funny and crazy use cases, but then when you look at how people actually use the product, it's often more sobering. They want to translate things or just copy things. And so as we venture into the space of AI, we have to be very mindful about what kind of UI are we creating, because if you create a fancy-looking futuristic UI, then it will create those same expectations for your product. And sometimes that can be problematic. And in order to understand this point better, I need to talk about toasters. This toaster in particular, this is a beautiful toaster from Muji. And the beauty about toasters is that it does one thing and it does it really well, right? Now, if you look on the other extreme of the spectrum, you have some general AI, like Samantha from the movie Her. Samantha is amazing, great user experience, but also very complex and very intelligent. So the problem is when you draw this on a business 101 graph with user experience on the left and intelligence on the right, then the toaster would be very dumb, but very, very good user experience. Now, Samantha would be very smart, very great user experience. And the problem is when you connect the line between the two, that's when you start to see the problem. And that's what my colleague at Google calls, Ricardo, he calls this the AI conundrum. Because the place where you don't want to be is this. And that's where most of the products today are. Because if you have a simple product and you add a little bit of AI on it, then what will happen is that people will think, whoa, that product must be really smart. And then it will just lead to a lot of disappointment. So more than ever, I feel that even though AI makes you feel like, oh, now we can do anything, it's actually quite the opposite. I think we have to be more focused than ever and really narrow down the problems that we want to solve. And that leads me to my last project, which is called the Next Generation Assistant. And Next Generation Assistant was a project that I've been leading for the last 1.5 years. And it's started with this insight from the machine learning team, from the speech team actually, where they were able to shrink the entire speech model down to 500 megabytes so that it could now fully run on device. And so we asked ourselves, what are the new experiences that we could build when voice runs fully on device? And what is a future where AI and your phone are basically one and the same thing? And so how would it affect how users interact with their technology? And so the design world we inhabit today, for the last 40 years actually, has been largely defined by what Ben Schneiderman called the direct manipulation principle. You drag on one end, and it automatically resizes. It's beautiful. But it turns out that this thing that is super, super easy in theory is actually very, very hard in practice. And the designers who usually excelled in the craft of digital design were usually the ones who just simply followed that direct manipulation principle. But I think with AI, we're at the verge of a new principle. We're at the verge of where it's no longer about direct manipulation, but about semantic manipulation. Because when you think about it, you're not telling the AI which buttons it should press for you. You're telling the AI or the assistant what it should do for you, and then it will do whatever it needs to do to be helpful for you. So in order to make sense of this technology and what we could do with it, I built a very abstract prototype at first. And this is how it looked like. And so there's a couple of shapes floating around. And as you can see, there's direct manipulation going on. And even though we have seen this so many times, I still think it's mind-blowing how good it feels to be able to change a shape like this.
Make it yellow. Make it red.
And I think what's interesting here is there's no UI to make it yellow or red.
Round the borders. Turn it into a circle.
And so you don't need to care about how it works. In this case, if you want to move it up and the assistant or something moves it up, but then you can still fine adjust it with your finger. So it doesn't really mean that it's just voice only. You can basically cooperate that experience, right? The AI can do some steps for you, and you can do the rest. So it is perhaps a little bit silly to look at this in the context of one shape, but I promise it gets more interesting when we look at it in the context of multiple shapes. So if you have multiple shapes, and let's say they're all floating around, and then you tell them, get out of the way, come back, align yourselves, arrange in a circle, rotate. Now, these are all things that would be really complicated to do because you only have 10 fingers, right? So, and the other thing is that your cognitive capacity is also limited, where a computer's capacity is not as limited as ours. So it is a really powerful instrument to orchestrate an experience. So you don't have to tap all the different elements, but that all that stuff is basically happening behind your back. And so this conceptual framing really helped to shape some of the use cases we were thinking about. So in this case, I'd like to show you this other prototype that I've worked on, which is basically now a much more realistic version of that same idea. So this is not real Android. Maybe you can tell. But if you go home, this is like my sandbox where I try to experiment. So these apps are also not real. Clearly, they don't enjoy being dragged up. But with Android Q, the Android team introduced gestural navigation. And with gestural navigation, that means that the assistant is now also, you can invoke the assistant with gestural navigation. And this is how it could look like.
Alarm at 8 a.m. Turn it off. How old is Barack Obama?
And I would like to, the thing, why is it so important to build this? Because if I hadn't built this, what happens when a user says turn it off in the context where the alarm was set? It's really important for you as a designer to be aware what's the current state. Again, it goes all back to the conversation we had about context. What is the context that your UI is in? Because the word it just changed its meaning depending on where you are in the experience. And so I then also, let me show you that other example now.
Show me my pictures. The ones on the beach. The ones with sunsets. Show them all.
So I went through the very painful process of creating my own photo applications for one reason and one reason only. That's because I needed to see how the animation works. Because when you have that filtering process, and I feel like there's something magical about this filtering experience where you can continuously talk your device and it does everything for you without the need to stop. But what's really interesting here was that when there wasn't an animation that reshuffled the things, it didn't feel like your voice made that happen. So the animation, as we talked about earlier, is critical if we want to convey how an AI can operate the experience that you're currently using. And so my takeaway here is design is a craft. Super generous statement, like super general. But I think most importantly, because my grandfather was a watchmaker, and when I was little, I always used to watch him like carefully assemble like those all finicky pieces. And I think our craft can really learn a lot, our industry can learn a lot from industrial design, because the industrial designers who excel in their craft are usually the ones who really know a wide range of materials. And digital design is also about what are the materials, what is the medium that you're working with. And so helping, like understanding the fundamentals of, you don't need to understand how AI as a whole works, that would be crazy. But it's really important to think about how does the fundamentals work. And so let me wrap up these key insights real quick. Takeaway 1 is really design the invisible, make sure you don't get trapped in a world of recognition, build something useful, even when a large part of it is boring. Takeaway 2 is the future isn't futuristic, because once the future is here, it's no longer the future, it's now the present. And once we understand how magic works, it's no longer magic. Once we understand how AI works, it's no longer AI. And once we understand how all these things work, we will no longer need a fancy UI. And takeaway number 3 is design is a craft. Get into the technology, try to understand how to build things, even though we live in a time where we have more design tools than ever that basically try to get us designers not uncomfortable by doing code. But I promise that if you start to look into these things, you will not just become more intentional, but also more mindful about how you approach these problems. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to my team.